is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness. That would be podcast episodes, bringing some of the best thinkers from the ivory tower right into your earbuds. That's because we don't want to think for you, we want to think with you. So you can brew your own faith, a zesty one. And today on the podcast is my friend, Brian McLaren. That's right, Brian McLaren and I are tackling a whole bunch of questions sent into us by the members of our current online group, Oh God, What Now? Christianity 20 years after 9/11. OhGodWhatNow.net if you want to join this fun, little, exciting online learning opportunity. He and I are joined by Diana Butler-Bass. It's been 6 sessions exploring different facets of the changing shape of Christianity. And in this little Q&A episode, not one of the 6 main sessions, we tackle questions. Ones around religious pluralism. Who is God? Shout-outs to hobbits. Spiral dynamics and stuff, the nature and possibility of prayer, the financialization of the sacred canopy. There's a whole bunch of exciting things. Brian talks about his experience listening to the rise and fall of Mark Driscoll, or Mars Hill, the podcast about Mark Driscoll. But we have a ton of fun answering these questions. It was a live stream for the group. So here you're going to get it. Now, before we jump in, I want to say one thing. The next online group for Homebrewed is a reading group on Soren Kierkegaard. That's right, the father of existentialism, the critic of Christendom, that 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian, Soren Kierkegaard. And I will be joined by the one and only Aaron Simmons, president of the Kierkegaard Society. He and I are going to be reading Soren Kierkegaard. We're going to be walking through the text with you, talking to you about it. If you want to do that, just go to iHeartKierkegaard.com. iHeartKierkegaard.com. Now, I don't want to waste any more of your time because a bunch of you sent in questions and Brian and I are here to attempt to answer them. And as you will see, Brian is indeed a wise fellow, high-quality friend, and we had a bunch of fun. So buckle that theological safety belt, because here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I am here with Brian McLaren, and we are going to provide above-average answers to a bunch of questions that you've been sending in. This is a Q&A. It's part of the Oh God, What Now 20 years after 9/11 class. For those of you that send in questions, they've been organized. Sometimes multiple people asked around the same topic, so I'll pick one or generalize. But hopefully we'll get to as many. And in the last session, we can pick up more. But maybe before we jump into specific questions, Brian, what thinking about where we've come so far in the class, nearing the end, has anything come to mind reflecting on the last 20 years that when we first started it, you didn't think this particular issue or this question or this moment would end up coming to mind so much?
Yeah. So actually that happened just a couple nights ago, and maybe I could tell a quick story that really, this is what came to mind. And I have to be, people will understand, I have to be a little discreet on giving specifics here, but on 9/11/2001, I was a pastor in the Washington, D.C. area. And I had a lot of people in my church who were pretty high up in the government. And, first I should say, any of us who are in Washington, D.C. will remember the anthrax scare that happened right at the same time. And what was interesting about the anthrax scare is that it seemed like an internal terrorism act. And so even at that first week after the attacks was this awareness that there's external terrorism and internal terrorism. I had a fellow in my church who had spent his whole career in intelligence working on terrorism. And obviously everybody was freaked out about the Al-Qaeda attacks, but the anthrax attack really had him nervous because this is what he had studied. And I was standing with him in his kitchen one night, and I said to him, I said, I'm sure you can't talk about this, because at that point, nobody knew where the source of this anthrax was. I said, should we all be heading for the mountains or something? And he started to cry. And literally he starts to cry. And he says, I've spent my whole career hoping this day would never happen. He said, the Pandora's box of dangers that are out there, he said, you just don't want to know about it. Well, the other quick anecdote from that time is that I had a friend and a fellow in my congregation who was fluent in Arabic, fluent in Islamic philosophy and so on. And he ended up having a role in the US government, helping them understand Al-Qaeda. And there was a philosopher named Khattab, Qutb, and Khattab's philosophy is what really influenced Osama bin Laden. And this friend, I was asking him about this philosophy, and he said, "Look, the philosophy is very simple. It's the philosophy of terrorism. You use an inexpensive attack against a superpower or an invading power, occupying power, colonial power. They have to use such expensive methods to protect themselves from future attacks that they have to raise taxes and they have to raise surveillance, and they make life worse for their own citizens. And so then their own citizens will rise up against them. So the idea of a whole lot of little small attacks to keep the superpower arrogantly spending money, is this brilliant strategy. And the real goal is internal division. And I just always remember that conversation, because you just think over leading up to January 6th, which I think we have to remember is an insurrection still in progress. The former president is still working on an insurrection plan, the second coming of the Antichrist, so to speak. To win by continuing division and discord. It's just amazing how successful that strategy was, and how everything that we did played into it so perfectly. My friend actually briefed top government officials on this and said, every single thing we've done is perfectly according to the plan outlined by Khattab. So here we are.
Oh man. Yeah, it's really frustrating. I remember feeling like after 9/11, like we're going to go to war. And then you find out everyone was lying to you, right? And then we've spent all this money, and now we can't get out of our way to spend, half that on addressing climate change when you see things getting worse, or caring for those that are being shut out of the economy. And that number's growing. And the number of people who know their kids don't have the same opportunities they have is growing and growing. Yeah. And that at some point, my biggest fear is that at some point, middle-class people in America are going to resort to actions that for a long time they thought impossible, right? Like if there's a portion of the population who decided things like January 6th or violent protests and stuff are possible, the more citizens put illiberal activities as the means to make your pain, anger, and resentment known, then the more justification you're going to get from a security state because most of the political power is there to protect the few, and it's just it's not going to be pretty. And I worry about it. Like even like one. I mean, I'm a part of a lot of like ecological activism groups, and the message boards where like ecological terrorism gets floated or brought up as jokes is now significant compared to what it was 5 or 6 years ago. And I don't think people are taking seriously what happens when people feel like they were sold lies that their well-being and their grandchildren's well-being are things that aren't on the agenda of the powerful. And we're supposed to believe that the current, political and civic institutions care. And like, anyway, like I'm, that worries me. That deeply worries me. And I don't, and I used to say, you should never resort to violence, these kind of things. But that's because you thought the system played fair in some way. And it was something that you could contribute to and make better. And now I'm like, well, you got a point. I don't know. I'm uncomfortable with my feelings reading this.
Well, if folks are interested in that, they should pick up the novel, The Ministry for the Future. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a novel where by the time you're halfway into it, it's a science fiction novel set a few decades in the future. The United Nations has realized that none of the nations are going to act in behalf of the future. So they set up the Ministry for the Future, which their task is to represent future unborn generations of humans and other creatures in the United Nations to at least give them a voice. But once they get into it and realize how entrenched the systems are, they start realizing nothing we can do is going to avert catastrophe. And then suddenly suddenly terrorism looks like it's what is being done by the oil barons. And it's just being done in plain sight. And suddenly, and all of that feeling that the whole thing's about to blow up, you really get that feeling when you read the book, which I think is intended by the author to make us say, let's get our act together now, fast. And I think that should, you don't want people so afraid that they're then paralyzed, because then their paralysis makes the doomsday scenarios inevitable. So yeah, we need empowerment to act now.
All right. So here's a question from Rachel. Rachel said, "Who is God?" I feel like there's an answer or an encounter or something that I get at when I use the word, but I don't know where to begin speaking when trying to speak about God. And how do I differentiate the past content to the word that was so troublesome and toxic? So
well, we're going to start off with a really small, easy to answer question and move up from there. So first of all, I tell you that what I want to say, I'd like to just give a reaction to the question. Then I'd love to hear your reaction to the questions before you even try to respond to it. But my reaction to the question is, Rachel, this is the question to raise. This is the question to raise, because what is so disturbing and harmful about our current ideas of God is the way they have been twisted and they become part of an ecosystem of suicide for our species and genocide for our species. So that question needs to be asked. But here's the thing. I think it needs to be asked in a way that you aren't expecting an answer that's as simple and definitive as the existing answers. In other words, right now we have existing answers, an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent being who rules and controls the world and created the world so that human beings could be sorted out into those who will experience eternal conscious torment and eternal conscious bliss. So if that's a very clear definition, if you want something that clear, you may be in trouble. In other words, the clarity itself could be trouble. And maybe the thing with God is that we're supposed to live the question with a spirit of humility and joy also, because even in asking the question is a sense that there might be a kind of current to the universe that's pulling us toward good, or a magnetism to the universe that's pulling us toward love. And so you learn to live that question with humility and joy. And I think you get to a better place. But that's just my response to the question. How would you respond to that?
I mean, I think the question of God's an important one to linger on. And I feel like there's an answer or an encounter.
Yes.
Right? And she put answer / encounter.
Yes.
Because the encounter is a kind of an answer, right?
Yes.
So, what was it? 16 years ago, I met you for the first time. And if someone asked me who Brian was, I would say the guy at this emergent thing, and someone told me I was emergent. So I went, and over time, we've gotten to know each other better than we've met each other's family, spent time together, worked on projects together, have a bunch of mutual friends. And so like part of understanding a person is there is an encounter, but if they are a genuine subject, they remain a mystery. And I think that one of the biggest problems from in kind of a toxic version of religion is somehow that knowledge of God implies finality, certainty, and fixed definition.
Yes.
But when you love and trust a person, you can get to know their character.
Yes.
But because you know their character, and because you trust them, and because they're real, part of preserving a relationship is letting them remain a mystery. If you don't let your partner remain a mystery, then you aren't loving them, right? You've made an idea of them in your head. And then, and I think that when it goes to God, there's this passage towards the end of Process and Reality, and I noticed it because I'm wearing the Whitehead shirt. This is probably
I see that.
Head. But he said that a lot of the images of God in the West, some envision God like a principle. It's like the ground of being or something like that.
Yes.
And you explain everything from this big philosophically rich category. Some see God as a power, a ruler, a kingly image. And others see God as like a law, like the moral law or the laws of the universe. And he goes, and much of the West are arguing between these three, but there's a fourth option, the Galilean vision. And he goes on describing what if what's harbored in God is the invitation of love, and what if that love, when fleshed out in life, is the story of Jesus.
Yes.
That's a very different image of God.
Yes.
But that image, he calls it the flickering Galilean image. It's not because there's not content to it. We have 4 gospels. We tell it. We are the body of Christ today. We experience it, but it's not something you possess and build on, like a principle or a power you rule over or a law you impose on others and assess. It is the invitation for self-giving, liberation-seeking love. And I think when you get that, the genuine love and relationship is an encounter, and you get clarity by actually living in that relationship, be it a person or the big mystery that those of us who are Christians, we say our answer to God, who's God, is a story about a homeless first century Jew. So that's not fixed. That's not final. But the certainty, if you're looking for it, is that you can trust giving yourself to the mystery. Who said that God's refused to be God without us, that you and your enemy are the beloved of God, and that the greatest is the one who becomes least. All those beautiful things. You're like, that's true. But anyway, something like that would be.
That's great. I know we've got a lot of questions. We could spend the whole time on this one. But I think that's so good. I love that. The flickering Galilean vision. which has an interesting dimension to it. I'm not around too many people who want to talk about this trip, so getting to talk to you about it is good. But one of the ideas of the incarnation, it seems to me, is that we sort of take that sky god and say that sky god is actually interested, that the sky god is actually, that the definitions we have of the sky god, the God up there, are problematic. And so we need somebody in human flesh to image it and live it and model it. And if we were to say, and Jesus' whole idea is not that he wants to be the only one who does this, but that he wants everybody possible to be able to experience this and embody this and image this. What that does is it says, instead of us, that the question of who is God is inseparably connected to the question of what kind of human beings do we want to be. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't it be interesting if one of the ways we find the answer to who is God is by, with all of the sincerity of our being, saying, this is my one and only life. What kind of human being do I want to be? And that we come to the answer to that question. That an inseparable element from asking who is God is to say, who do I want to become? What kind of person do I want to become? And like, that's why, to me, as you say, as soon as you fix it, you're in a lot of trouble, because now your quest, the ring of power is within reach. But if the call is always from the future, to say there's more, keep growing, keep learning, that has an intrinsically humbling dimension to it.
Mm-hmm. So I found the passage.
Fantastic!
So it's when the Western world accepted Christianity, Caesar conquered, and the revised text of Western theology was edited by his lawyers. The Code of Justinian and the Theology of Justinian are 2 volumes expressing one movement of the human spirit. The brief Galilean vision of humility flickered through the ages uncertainly. But the deepest idolatry was that of fashioning God in the image of the Egyptian, Persian, and Roman imperial rulers. The church gave unto God the attributes which belonged exclusively to Caesar.
Ooh, wow. Is that from Process and Reality?
Yeah, it's in part 5. Page 342 for all those reading along. And earlier in that section's where he lays out the 3 different kind of categories of the divine. And I think that the thing that always struck me about Whitehead, but there are other people who do this, so don't hear this as like everyone should be into it, but was that his critique of our ideas of God was to say, what if our vision of God, when he's doing it poetically, resonated with the most beautiful expressions of human life? And what if that beautiful expression, like the person, the life of Jesus, right, resonates deeply with the source of all existence? And what if finding life means to share in it, right? Like, and he's just speaking poetically at the end of a really boring philosophy book. But, and you're called to participate in it. And then you say to yourself, like, all those parts of the New Testament that most Protestants pretend are metaphors, like you're baptized into the body of Christ, that we actually want the same mind to be in us that is in Christ Jesus. Like all these images of participating. And even if you look even in the synoptics, Jesus is always trying to hand off the mission. He sends out the 12, sends out the 70. After the resurrection in Acts, he gives them 40-day lectures on the kingdom of God and tells them to wait for the Spirit and then go do it, right? Like the whole New Testament is the coming of the Christ is the invitation to be the Christ. Not because
Yes.
God didn't do anything in Jesus. It's not deflating that. It's actually affirming that this radical new breakthrough you saw in Jesus's yes to God is an invitation for us to participate in that deeply faithful reality. In my recent book, which is really nerdy, I talk about that participatory picture of Jesus being the reciprocity. Jesus's full faithfulness and his full faithfulness to the one he calls Abba has a deep correspondence with God's hesed love, faithfulness to the world. And in the person of Jesus, you see the fusion of the world and God. And so you can say literally and mean it, like Jesus is the image of the invisible God.
Yes.
The firstborn of all creation. And like when he was saying participate in the life, or I am the vine and you are the branch, all those things.
Yes.
They're actual invitations for life. And I think so much church is worried about defending a fixed image of God, having finality and certainty. And right there in the New Testament, you have this invitation to life abundantly and an image of love that, at least for me, remains compelling. And so that's why, like, the who is God question, I always think of, like, I need it to resonate with Jesus. If your answer to who God is isn't even if God's not as nice as Jesus, then it shouldn't be Christian. And that gets rid of a lot of popular Christian theology. But it seems like minimal viable Christian theology should be, is your God, when you answer the question, at least as nice as Jesus? And if it's not, it's just not Christian yet. And that's okay.
Yeah.
There's lots of heresies. Anyway,
but anyway, and let's just say, God bless Rachel for raising that question. That's the question that we should live.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. Here's a fun one. John asked a question. I'm flipping my earpiece around. There are a couple specifically about religious pluralism, but John's is.
Hi, Diana, Brian, Tripp. I'm an American Christian who's lived in the Middle East for 13 years, and my faith has been radically transformed by my interactions with Muslims. I'm wondering how you three see the future of the Christian faith, how it might change and evolve in light of our proximity to and engagement with the religious other. I'm also interested in hearing how you view the spectrum between identity, maintaining one's Christian identity, and openness and hospitality to the insights of the divine from the religious other.
All right. Could you hear that?
I sure could.
Excellent.
Sure could. Well, you want to go first, or should I?
You can, because you everyone. I'm sure it was your talk that inspired the question. So first, if folks are interested, and let me just say, when authors mention one of their books, it's not because they're trying to sell a book. It's because they worked for a year, or a couple of years, or several years on something, and they feel this question is so important that they want you to know they could get a much more thorough answer there. And so I wrote a book called "Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road?" And the subtitle was "Christian Identity in a Multi-Faith World." So. And it grew directly out of 9/11, and it is really addressing this question. So that could be a useful resource to people. But let me just begin by saying, folks who have never had a respectful human encounter with the religious other have no idea how important this question is. And one of the blessings of my life, having grown up fundamentalist evangelical, I was taught in that background to see everyone who wasn't a born again Christian, as we defined it, as a child of Satan, lost in darkness, whereas we were children of the light. And just this dualism that created an inferior and excluded other.
And so my approach to every relationship with the other was to try to convert them, which meant that I couldn't possibly ever learn from them, or even see their beauty. I mean, there's just so much harmful about that, and it's still so rampant. And by the way, it's not just Christianity. I mean, there's a Catholic version, a Protestant version, but there's Muslim versions of hostility toward the other, and Jewish versions of hostility toward the other. Every religion has a pole that defines itself in opposition to the other. But when you enter into respectful and beautiful engagement with the other, I'll just say it. Almost everybody I've ever met who ends up in those kinds of experiences feel that's part of their encounter with God, that there's something about the other that brings them into encounter with God, especially when you're the beneficiary of the kindness of the other. It is unspeakably beautiful. And you sense God was just here. God was pleased. Whatever God is, this was an encounter. So there's so much. Howard Thurman had saying something like, every community becomes stale and stagnant and needs an encounter with the other in order to, have a fresh start. And it's just so interesting in the Bible how all of these strange others show up and people find the next part of their journey with God. Abram and Melchizedek, all of the strange visitors in the book of Genesis, Jethro to Moses. And then you even fast forward to the Gospels and Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, especially in Matthew's Gospel, which is so haunting and pivotal and fascinating and rich on so many levels. So all that's to say, the encounter with the other is deeply important. And I think there are probably three others that are especially important at this moment. The first one is Islam. Christianity is about 33% of the population. Islam, 24%, 21 to 24%. Hinduism, about 17%. And secularism now is about the same size as Hinduism worldwide, 17, 18%. So if we were to just say the major others that are facing Christianity being Islam, Hinduism, and secularism or unidentified religious spirituality or atheism or whatever, those three categories, we have some really, really important conversations to have with each. And I think they could help each of us grow. Maybe the other thing I'll say before I hand it back to you, over to you, Trip, is that one thing that when you grow up like I did in this, in some ways, intentionally ignorant form of Christianity that doesn't even want to look at Christian history because we just go to the Bible, you can be terribly naive. The fact is, Christianity has been shaped by its encounter with other religions since the beginning. And I'll just give one really interesting, one example that's interesting to me. So in the early centuries of Christianity, Greek philosophy, especially kinds of Platonic philosophy, are super, super powerful in the world. And a lot of the early Christian apologists or thinkers realized if they wanted Christianity to get a hearing, they needed to express it in terms of the dominant and most prestigious philosophical framework of the day, which was Platonism. And so what ended up happening is for major parts of the Christian world and Christian history, the categories of Platonism helped define Christianity. Then you come to the Middle Ages, where Islam is now knocking on the door from the south through Spain and from the east through Turkey and from the southwest, from the Levant. And the Christian faith is for the first time, has some dialogues with Muslims. They're killing each other, but they're also having some conversations. And it turns out that the Christians had all of Plato's writings and the Muslims had all of Aristotle's writings. And as many people would know, one of the primary arguments in Greek philosophy is the argument between Plato and Aristotle. So what happens is some Christian monks and scholars say, I'll trade you 3 Platos for 2 Aristotles, and they start trading manuscripts back and forth. And when Aristotle comes into the Christian world, suddenly Christians have a leverage point to try to rediscover their parts of their gospel that have been obscured by Platonism or rendered invisible by Platonism. And what a lot of people don't know is what Catholics would say is the greatest thinker in Christian history, Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, in many ways, was simply thinking with Aristotle after centuries of people only thinking with Plato, and Aristotle through the gift and the generosity of Muslims. So this is a long, ongoing process. And maybe the only other thing I'd say is, so if we take Muslims seriously, who in many ways have been as shaped by Aristotle as Christians have by Plato, as well as all of the own unique treasures that they bring. And then you think Hinduism, all the dharmic traditions that arise from Hinduism, what a fascinating conversation partner. And if people are interested, they can look at people like Bede Griffiths and so many who are Raymond Panikar and so many others who have deeply engaged as Christians with the dharmic traditions, and John Cobb and others who have done this with other parts of the dharmic traditions. And then third, our engagement with secularism and atheism, and especially fueled by people who take science seriously and evolution seriously, and philosophers who do this. My gosh, what an exciting cocktail for future development, to deeply dig into our own roots, but do it in conversation with these others.
Oh, yeah. That's good. All right. I'll retweet what Brian just said. When you mentioned the Jesus encounter with the other and the Syrophoenician woman in my book, which I actually want you to buy it, unlike Brian, who just says it because he was important to him. But it doesn't show up with my monk, with the Hobbit background. But I use the story of the Syrophoenician woman where, she tells Jesus, like, well, you're going to help me out here. And he's like, no, dog. And she's like, well, dogs get bread off the table, like off the table is flicked off. And he was saying no because of, ethnic group. And at that point, his vision for his ministry was much smaller than God's vision of the kingdom of God. Right. And so it's his encounter with the other. And what does he do? But he actually opens up, right? So the Syrophoenician woman ends up healing, right? Like her daughter, and I use the language like that was Jesus catching up to being the Christ, because in it he actually shows us like what does faithfulness look like? It actually looks like this when you encounter the other.
Yes,
and did it mean that he was no longer Jewish or the Christ? No, but it did mean that encounters with the other become invitations for growth. And so Jesus there models what that is for us to look like. So here's an image, and I can't remember who gave it to me or if I thought it up. So people that listen to the podcast may know who said this, but I've used it multiple times since then. Is it religious traditions for most of human history have had momentary encounters like you just shared, but so often their conversations have been internal. And then you can get divisions within it, and then they separate over time and then have to figure out what to do with an ecumenical one. But now we're at a place where in any major cities, you have the wisdom traditions that for so long have had particular stories, rituals, and practices gaining wisdom through the lived experience of all those people and their encounter with the divine. And it's like all of a sudden, these storehouses of wisdom are neighbors. And what do you do with it? Some people encounter that difference and go, I am never going to bring ginger into my spice rack. Because when I spell ginger, I think of a different ethnic group and a different religious tradition. And I think one of the images of encountering the other is what is it like for us to have our home and like my family are Southerners. Yeah, I make biscuits in Scotland and people don't know what they are. And I share them with my neighbors. But also, I have learned to make some really, really delicious Indian Scotland fusion food because they have this whole this whole way you put yogurt into traditional Indian dishes to then get this creamy stuff. Then you put it on your rice. Anyway, like the Scottish version of Indian fusion curry. When I went home last time, I made it for all my family and friends. And they're like, what is this? Where did this come from? I'm my neighbor's spice rack. And I brought the spices with me because you just don't even buy them at most stores. And my family ate them. I didn't change. I'm still me. And so, like, in one sense, I think part of the otherness is, like, when you encounter other traditions, what are ways they can bless your spice rack? And then what kind of things do you have to do with it? Because the actual point of wisdom traditions, and this is true for all of them, it's like what happens at the meal with all the people you love. That's where the magic happens. But anyway, so the spice rack image I found really helpful. I'm pretty sure I stole it from someone and don't remember who. But and also, if we ever get to start traveling regularly again, and I'm in your area, you can ask tips on making curry because I
like that. This is such an important question. Let me just add on the Syrophoenician woman. There's so much more. We could spend hours just talking about that one episode, especially the differences between the Gospels. Matthew's Gospel calls her a Canaanite woman, which is interesting because there were no Canaanites in Jesus' day. This would be like calling, someone from Minnesota a Viking or because they're Norwegian ancestry, whatever. And then to watch what happens after that when Jesus goes on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee and heals, 3,000 people, I think, after having healed 5,000 Jews. And then the implication is these are 3,000 Gentiles, at least in Matthew's Gospel. And so the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 is replicated among Gentiles in Matthew's Gospel as a way, I think, of Matthew offering this commentary. How do we define our contact with Canaanites, religious outsider, who's seen as an enemy? And of course, as soon as he calls her a Canaanite, it brings to mind the slaughter of the 7 Canaanite nations. And as if to throw a little trick in there, I think Matthew's Gospel has there be 7 baskets left over, as if to say, in the story, as opposed to the 12 baskets when Jews are fed, as if to say, I know you have heard it said in old times that when we encounter the other, we slaughter them in a genocide. But I say to you, we feed the other, and we're hospitable to the other, and we learn to heal the other. And so that's a start on a very, very different trajectory. But as I recall, there are only 2 times in the Gospels where Jesus changes his mind. Both are with a woman, one his mother in the Cana story, and then the other this Syrophoenician Canaanite Sidonian woman. And it's so, what that says to me is that the gospel writers want us to see Jesus not just as a model of perfection, but as a model of growth. And as you say, at that moment, and in both of those 2 moments, Jesus basically says no, and then says yes. And for people who don't want to ever say Jesus was wrong or made a mistake, well, you don't need to say that, because Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. So you could just say the gospel writers are letting us watch Jesus grow as a message to us. You better keep growing too, including in the way you see the other.
Well, and don't you think that it's noticing that's important now, right? Because one of the things that we face as Christians after these 20 years is the need for us to grow, right? Like part of what's been revealed are the ways in which the faith we inherited is not big enough for the world we're called to love.
Well said.
But that growing and changing, we could be faithful as the body of Christ today, just like Jesus was when he encountered the Canaanite woman and when his mom called him out. And I think that kind of, I'll put it this way, a lot of people, when they leave behind something, say they were really harmed and hurt in a religious community, or they feel betrayed that they were given such a small picture, like the Bible has to be literal or it's not true, or right. Like when you leave some vision or encounter with the gospel and the church and you leave it behind, then all of a sudden you kind of are real allergic to what you left. And there's can be anger and frustration, and some of it's required for the growing and healing part. But others, like we think when we leave it behind, we're leaving behind the God that was encountering us in those places.
Yes.
And I think those images of Jesus are ones where, I bet if you had asked him a theology quiz before he got called out by the Canaanite woman about his mission relating to Gentiles, he would have failed.
Yes.
But he actually was faithful when he encountered that difference. And it was that fidelity that then that gives content to that whole story before. And a lot of our growth in this time is the need to cherish the ways we've been blessed by the past and leave behind the ugliness. But so much of it involves growth and going, like like someone forgiving you and telling you you're loved. Like you can preserve that and you can grow beyond those words not being fit for someone because they're gay or lesbian, or, or they're not being fit because they're in a different religious tradition, or you couldn't imagine God's love extending to your atheist neighbor. Like you can leave that part behind and grow into something bigger. And Jesus had to outgrow, the kind of ethnocentric inheritance of his rural Galilean religious vibes. So,
Well said. Well said. I mean, gosh, every one of these questions is just so rich, but maybe I'll add one last thing and then I'm done on this one. It's also important for people to realize that even the people who say that they're not going to change in relation to the other, they change. Because the act of resisting change changes you. And so in many ways, if we were to say that let's just talk about the US, but we know there's a Philippine version of this, and there's a Mexican version of this, and a Brazilian version of this, and an Italian version of this. But as America, you and I being from the US, white American Christians, Catholic and Protestant, had major deficiencies in 2001. 20 years later, most of them, their deficiencies are much worse. They're more hostile toward the other. They're more afraid of the other. They hate Muslims rather than have learned to understand them as their neighbor. They, I remember after Abu Ghraib, when white evangelical Christians were the people most supportive of torture, I think of any group, and they were more supportive of torture than Muslims in the Middle East. So you just realize that when a provocation comes across your path, you either become better or bitter. And you're going to change one way or the other. And so this question just says, let's keep our hearts and eyes and minds open to the ways we can change for the better in our ongoing encounter with the other, because the other keeps changing and we keep changing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that actually connects with a question Chad sent in. He said, in this week's session, there was talk about how we live within tents that are nested, families, churches, communities, nations, religions, etc. I was wondering if y'all have made any connections between this conversation and integral theory, Ken Wilber and such. And he goes on describing stuff for a while. And in that way of thinking, the higher good is always more connectedness. How might you see our connectedness, maybe due to technology or something, as an accelerator for interreligious connectedness?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's the perfect question to follow up on this last question. But of course, what we see is the internet becomes this kind of neutral tool at best, and people can use it to spread misinformation about the other and to go down their rabbit holes of bigotry and idiocy. and chosen intentional idiocy that sometimes isn't even malevolent. It's more like an illness that overtakes them. They're so traumatized by stress and diversity that they're sucked down a rabbit hole of sameness and homogeneity, racial homogeneity or religious homogeneity, and so on. So I think we see that connectedness always is a choice, and you can always choose to disconnect. I do some work with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and one of Richard Rohr's 7, elements of what he calls alternative orthodoxy is that the separated self is the problem. It's yourself isn't a problem, but when yourself separates from the common good and separates from your neighbor and separates in that way from God, and I think the same applies to groups. The separated group, the group that only seeks its own, is the problem. And so this call toward greater integration and connectedness is that's what the call to love is. That's the greatest of these is love. Faith is good. Hope is good. The greatest thing is love, and love is that moving toward connectedness that doesn't obliterate difference, but that celebrates difference. And I love what you said before, Tripp, that when you love someone, you always leave a mystery to them. You don't define them or box them in. Part of that is saying they're allowed to change and grow. Mm-hmm. And so this connectedness always allows the beloved other to continue to change and grow. Sometimes that means lamenting with broken heart when they change in a bad direction, but that's not our job to determine how they change. Our job is to say, okay, now I have the challenge. How do I love them? It just got a little bit harder. Mm-hmm. But that remains my call. So, and if it was a Chad, was that his name? If Chad is interested in, I've read a lot of Ken Wilber's books, found them superbly helpful. I found them even more helpful when I made sure he wasn't the only theorist of human development and civilizational change that I read. In other words, when I read others, it didn't make him less helpful. It made me appreciate him, but I think in a more comprehensive way. So,
yeah, and one of the things I'd just say for those that haven't read Ken Wilber or any of the developmental theorists, when it's applied to something like how religion's changed in the last 20 years, right? If you think of the percentage of religious members in just say like dominant Western culture, there is a move from there's like the more communitarian minded who's what does faithfulness look like is commitment to the tribe. How's that expressed when it's anxious? Purity, right? Those type to those that value the rational tribe, and then you get into more kind of postmodern, like that whole how the last 20 years has played out is one where early in the 20th century, the rational mind in that group assumed its perfection in a sense. They assumed that it was the solution, right? The end of history, that kind of logic, that we had the institutions of how the church and the state and the economy relate. And we just need to get rid of these dumb people below us. If they just figure out how to be like us, we'll get it fine-tuned and working great. And the like terrorism followed by Christian support for global violence and ignorance around the violence of global capitalism to the poor across has meant that you now have a globe where there are people at all sorts of different developmental levels responding out of self-protection.
Yes.
And everyone still acts like the way you understand your religious tradition is the ideal type. And it just sets up for violence. And you can see it at Thanksgiving tables to others. And one of the gifts of seeing how different people and different communities change over time is to recognize that it's not the destination that's superior. It's the expression of that kind of life. And a good example is the most Christian community in America in the last 20 years has been the Black church. And if you ask them theology questions, and you are a liberal, enlightened white Protestant like me, and I'm saying this in scare quotes if you're just listening, they give a lot of the same answers the white evangelical Protestants give that are really conservative on issues. I think they just haven't reckoned with science and biblical criticism. But then which community has expressed the healthiest, most vibrant expression of the life of Christ? I don't think there's lots of debate, right? It's not white mainline Protestants, right? It's not the white Catholics. It's definitely not white evangelicals, right? So you see what I mean? Like it's not so much what stage you're at that is about faith. It's what state and what's being expressed in it. So then when you ask yourself, as you're a leader, how do you help people express the less anxious, more vibrant expression of the stage of faith that anyone's at in a given moment? Because you're not in control of moving people through stages or naming one as better or worse and that kind of thing. How would you describe it? Because I know in was it 2 books ago that you did the type 1, 2, 3, 4 thing?
Yeah.
How would you describe that shape? Well, I mean, say a bit about it, but how would you describe how things have shifted in the last 20 years, thinking about the different kind of large stages of faith?
So actually, this book just came out in January called Faith After Doubt. And I in a previous book, Naked Spirituality, I used the same framework, but you could take Ken Wilber's 9 basic stages, and I simplify it into 4: simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. And if anybody's interested in the appendix in that book, I correlate, a dozen or so different theorists, because it's a similar pattern that they're observing and describing. And by the way, it's important to get non-white scholars on this and non-male scholars on this. So, and interestingly, a lot of this work is done around the idea of identity development, which relates so much to what we've talked about. How a white person grows up and finds out they're white, or how a Black person grows up, finds out they're Black, and what that means in their context, and the struggles that faces them with how do I cope with this thing that I didn't choose and I wasn't even aware of as I grew up. So, but a way to say it is stage 1 simplicity is dualistic, and that's sort of the basic framework of civilization. Stage 2 is pragmatic, complexity is pragmatic. Stage 3, perplexity, is where critical thinking comes in, and it's somewhat relativistic and pluralistic. And then stage 4 is an attempt to integrate and to be guided and directed by love. So what you could say is, I think the United States has always liked stages 1 and 2. We like to be simplistic and dualistic, and we like to make money, and that takes us into complexity. So we're very pragmatic. But when we got into a conflict, we reverted to a militant form of stage 1. Meanwhile, the people in stage 3 became more and more disdainful of those people in stage 1. They said, they made fun of them, and they despised them. It's that sort of liberal despising of conservatives. Now, then what do conservatives do? They despise liberals. And so then you end up with this polarization, in my mind, between stage 1 and stage 3. And the problem is they don't have the resources to solve that problem. And that's what I call stage 4, that we need people to move into a stage where they're able to look with love upon the stage 1 and stage 3 people who hate each other. But you made a point a minute ago, Tripp, that I think is really, really useful. And folks who know Ken Wilber know he distinguishes between a state and a stage. But you're using state in a slightly different way. And I think it's a really helpful way too, where you say, look, if you're a stage 1 person and you're anxious, stage one in an anxious state is very different than stage one in a generous and relaxed state. And we'd say the same thing about each of the other stages. And so the state of anxiety tends to bring out our worst. And this is one of the huge challenges right now. This is a bit of a tangent, but almost everybody I know is at their worst or close to being at their worst. Well, or let's say it this way, they're not at their best because all of us are under stress. And how do we learn? This is where we need those basic skills of love, like love is patient, love is kind, love doesn't seek its own way. We need those basic qualities of love when we're dealing with one another. We're all like, 4-year-old kids who didn't get a good sleep last night and ate way too much sugar today, and a cold is coming on. We've got all these things bringing us to our crankiest, grumpiest self.
So there are two questions about this, and you can take it whichever way you want. But both Ted and Mindy asked, we're having this conversation of how things have changed in the last 9/11. What do you make of all the different ways people you used to be friends with went? And then Mindy was like, I was part of the emerging church movement. And I've been listening to the podcast about Mark Driscoll. WTF, like, how can Brian talk me down for not just saying horrible and hateful things about him? What can we learn from processing this? I know they were friends at some point, that kind of, and I'm editing her. But like when you think of, because all of a sudden, that like the story of Mars Hill as like one expression of a group that you were connected to early on, like how would you think through that process, and what is there to learn about all the different places collection of young leaders ended up 20 years later?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So Tripp, if you ever decide to host a discussion on that podcast series on Mars Hill, I'll listen. I'd be happy to be part of it, but I'd be really happy to listen, because I came late to that podcast series, but I just listened to it recently. And first of all, the thing that interested me the most, I forget the name of the fellow who's the host of it. Do you remember?
No.
But like obviously he does a great job, and he's put his heart into this. But what the thing I couldn't help but think is, this ends up being kind of an inside baseball discussion. How do white evangelicals deal with one of their own who obviously goes off the rails? Although a lot of people don't think he was so off the rails. And in my mind, Mark Driscoll really is the stand-in for Donald Trump. And to talk about Mark Driscoll is a way for evangelicals to talk about Donald Trump, because the similarities are so striking in manner and so on. It sort of brings us back to a theme that we had earlier. When I knew Mark, I think I met him in 1998. I was super impressed by his intelligence. He was extraordinarily intelligent and gifted. But the second time I think I met Mark, he pulled me aside, and I'll never forget this. We were walking down a sidewalk in New York City, and he said to me, and I won't quote him, I just don't, I don't judge people who talk this way, but I won't use his exact language. But he said, "You got to remember this about me, Brian. I'm a street fighting son of a paper hanger, blue collar paper hanger," something like that, or drywall guy. I forget what he said. He said, "And I'm an effing fundamentalist." And what was really interesting is I think he knew that I was not a fundamentalist. And I think he was sort of warning me to say, this is who I am. And don't just because I can speak in complex sentences, don't think that I'm like you. So I always remember that as a sort of charitable moment on Mark's behalf, that he didn't want to mislead me about who he really was. And he's certainly proven that's was being true. What's that old saying from I forget, was it Maya Angelou or Bell Hooks? If someone shows you who they are, believe them.
Yeah.
So, but the one that really struck me in the Mars Hill podcast series was not the ones about Mark Driscoll. It was the one about Josh Harris. And I felt like what I was witnessing was evangelicalism playing out Girardian dynamics. That if you're going to throw somebody to your right to the wolves, you have to find somebody to your left and throw them to the wolves too. That's the way that you prove that you're still the true article in some ways. And so, but watching all this just gives me this huge feeling of compassion that everybody's doing the best they can. They get brought up in some heritage or they're converted into it, and then they find out its dark sides and they're trying to make it better. And I suppose one of my acts of faith is to try to say that nobody is beyond redemption, and that all of us can have a bad decade or two, and not just to say this about others, but about ourselves too, to realize all of us could go wrong in 100 different ways. When I say wrong, I'm not just talking in a stage one simplistic sense, but I'm saying we could get unhealthy and harmful. So
I was only listening to the podcast about that podcast that my friend Dan Koch and Tony Jones have been doing until people kept asking me about it. And so then I, listened to it at 2.5x while I was mowing to catch up. And, that Josh Harris thing was fascinating because, the response when he started to sell the class on how to deconstruct basically, the pushback of people that were just hurt by him, he's a poster child for purity culture and stuff. That was interesting because and then they had already recorded that interview, but that, like, how you have pity on someone you think is vile and harmful in lots of ways. I always think of the when Frodo, it's this, because I'm sitting in Hobbit hole right here, says to Gandalf, he's like, "Oh, it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance." And Gandalf goes, "Pity? It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many in life deserve death. Some that die deserve life. Can you give it to him, Frodo? And do not be so eager to deal out death and judgment. Even the very wise cannot see all ends." And then he goes on and says, "My heart tells me Gollum may have some part to play for good or ill before it's over. But should it be good, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of us all." It's the last line, right? Again, multiple times throughout the story, Gandalf is always questioning when people think someone should be cut out of the story.
Yes.
And even though he agrees with the judgment, right? Like, it's not like he's saying, like Gollum's a wonderful character. But I always feel like I'm like Frodo, like, man, we should have taken him down earlier, and Gandalf goes like, where, who died and made you God, kind of thing.
And could I just say that? And that's an example that all of us are prone to having those bad and grumpy days and unhealthy states of mind or heart or spirit, where we just want revenge, or where we're bothered and anxious and we just want somebody to blame for it and flay for it. It's interesting. A few days ago, somewhere in my timeline or whatever for Twitter, whatever it's called, I saw an article written by, I think it was by some conservative evangelical, could have been Catholic, just tearing Joshua Harris apart and saying that, and it seems to be the narrative that's being built is that everything's fine with evangelicalism except for celebrity culture. It's celebrity culture, and that's an oversimplification, but celebrity culture becomes the explanation. It's the theodicy in a certain sense for how something so good could become bad. And this article was far more vicious than anything on the podcast. But what I felt, and I never read Josh Harris. I didn't, I never, so I have no data. But here's what my experience tells me. Josh Harris wasn't into celebrity culture. Josh Harris was a true believer. He tried to be a good boy. And so all he did is he grew up in that setting, and he took their message and made it very visible and very specific. And he was talented enough to write about it in a way that a lot of people wanted to read it. And all he did was channeled the heart of his tradition. And eventually, to me, what's amazing is when it stopped working for him, and when he saw the harm it was doing, he had the courage to say, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And because here's to me, the real tragedy. How many tens of thousands of people, including a whole lot of pastors and denominational officials, are as disillusioned with their form of Christianity as Joshua Harris was with his, and yet they keep taking the salary and keep getting up and saying the whole thing and keeping the machine going because it's the family business or the company that they're part of now. So anyway, I just feel like you know how in the liturgy, in the traditional liturgy, we say, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. When I say that, I don't feel like I'm just saying it about me. Feel like I'm looking at the whole screwed up hot mess world and saying, God have mercy on us all. We're all such a mess.
Oh yeah. Could you because he wrote that book when he was like 18 or 17, like super young, could you imagine selling millions of copies and being known for your thoughts about God at 17?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, you've publicly changed your mind on some things and grown, but like you can see threads of continuity. But like, I mean, when I was like 17, I was like reading Kierkegaard and Charles Spurgeon. Like I'm like, if I had like hit it big with like the edgy, angsty, like very reformed, like background trip, and then you're deciding like, maybe I like process. Like it's a long ways from there to today. And I have no idea what would happen if there was a culture that was like, could you be our banner boy? And could we give you millions of dollars to,
oh my goodness,
to be 18-year-old Trip again?
Oh my gosh. And the truth is, I'm sure when he wrote that book, he had no idea it was going to sell a million copies. He's just trying to be a true believer in the community. People often ask me, do you have any of your books that you would recant or whatever? And my typical answer is, I'm so fortunate I didn't write my first book until I was 42. So that gives you a little advantage to be on this side of 40.
Well, one of the other questions that was connected to that was this class, and they referenced listening to the podcast and stuff, has made me think of all the ways I've changed my mind in the last 20 years. So what were the changings of the mind that were most hard for y'all? So like things where you changed your mind and it was really clear and it.
Yeah. Does one come to your mind right away? I sort of need a minute to think about it.
Well, if you do go through the whole 20 years, some of the early ones were, the questions around, divine power and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest, changing of my mind was, not so much like a specific idea, but just a disposition to change. Like my natural, I'm sure if I take psychological profile, I'm not built for like the completely adventurous, open to anything everywhere type of thing. And I recognized that early on and had to change my mind to relate to difference. But the biggest idea was like changing my mind that like the church is really the solution for much of anything. And that was like a sad thing, but that's like, I think it can be, and for a lot of people be beautiful, but because my experiences with the church are so positive growing up, I was like always committed to it. And then the longer I've lived, the more people who the pain that's been inflicted on them by people in the name of Jesus, and it's particularly the institutions and communities, the harder it is for me to think that the church really is the best space for everyone. You know, and I don't mean it like, oh, you have to go to get into heaven or anything like that. I just used to be like gun ho, like this is amazing. But I know so many people whose wounds are real and the trauma is connected to it that like changing your mind on that really hurt me. Like it was sad. And most of my friends didn't have positive church experience to then realize that's not the case. And that one was like much harder than changing my mind about lots of other stuff that, like, you know, the origins of consciousness. I changed my mind on that. The nature of the economic and immanent trinities relations. Changed my mind on it a few times. Whether or not you proceed with your doctrine of God informed by science and engaging religious pluralism before doing Christological reflection, or you work back from the encounter with God and Christ to other doctrines. Like I've changed my mind on that. Didn't lose sleep on those, you know? So.
My gosh, Trip, you just said so many things that I just say, that's exactly what's happened to me over these 20 years. Well said. Well said. I feel the same way. I've had lots of theological shifts just as part of growth and new scholarship that I come in contact with, and new people I meet and get a chance to hear it, give them a fair hearing. But the hardest one is 20 years ago. I just feel like these 20 years have shown our institutional expressions of Christian religion. I'm not against institutions. I'm a big fan of institutions. You know, we need institutions. So I'm not against institutions, but watching the way to which our institutions are held captive to money and white supremacy. I think the power of money and white supremacy in white Christianity have just, and if I want to make it a trinity, money, white supremacy, and patriarchy, you know, that ends up being this unholy trinity that I just realize is way more powerful than I realized. As you know, the book I've been working on lately is called Do I Stay Christian? It comes out next May, but that's one of I got to really delve into sort of my growing feelings about those issues and some others in the writing of that book. But if I were to also say one thing that's changed for me in these 20 years that I didn't anticipate that we haven't already covered, I'll share this by way of an anecdote. I met this well-known economist who doesn't identify as a Christian, but he cares about the poor and he cares about the planet. And I'm a big fan of his economic work. His name is David Korten, Korten. We became friends some years ago, and I called him a year or two ago. It was after the pandemic, so probably 2019, or when the pandemic had started, or 2020, I'm sorry. And I said, David, I'm having a spiritual crisis I need to talk to you about. And he said, what's that? I said, I used to think that theology framed people's lives and economics and politics happened within their theological framework. I said, I'm doubting that now. What I'm starting to believe is that economics frames people's lives and they develop their theology and politics within the boundary conditions set by the way they make a living. And I said, and that's a really scary thought to me, and I wonder if you've thought about it. And David said, please don't tell me that. He said, because I know you're in the world of religion. If you think religious fundamentalists are bad, wait till you meet economic fundamentalists. But to me, this is something I really feel I have to come to terms with, is that it feels like psychologically the categories of morality and rationality are so shaped by the market, the economy that we live in. That, and maybe the act of realizing that, I've been interested in biases. I have some work I've done on biases. Maybe what I'm talking about is a bigger expression of what I call cash bias or economic bias, but it really is powerful. And when I have those thoughts, I think when Jesus said you either love God and hate money or love money and hate God, that stark dualism is one of the smartest things I've ever heard.
Yes. I recently was making a list of book titles to think through, and one of them was called "We Hate God," and a guide to American religion. And the whole premise of it is for a long time, religion was the mythopoetic structure that mediated our relationships to neighbor, nature, and enemy. And so sacred.
You got to say that again. That's quote worthy.
So religion was the mythopoetic structure that mediates our relationships with our neighbors, nature, and enemy. So, and the sacred.
Yes. And
so, think of the sacred canopy vision, right? Or so, there's a bunch of theorists that do this. And next week for our last session, my opening, I used a little bit of this because I've been thinking a lot about it, is that when you all share a sacred canopy, then you're born into it, you learn the language, and all of a sudden there's this deep resonance. So everything you encounter with the world's been filtered through this sacred canopy, so it has meaning and all this vibrancy and this kind of stuff. The Enlightenment, and then pluralism and scientific, all these types of criticisms that emerge to them, fracture it and then reveal it as what it is, an actual thing we've constructed and you've inherited it. But then you're in a world that's no longer interpreted through a grid that has meaning and purpose and value on it. And then the story we tell about ourselves scientifically and things starts to fill in the gaps. And then you have trouble, right? Talking about the good life, all these type of things. The church gets dethroned in the West, and the state becomes how you manage fights between religions. So we need a kind of religion that can be privatized to then not have the 30 Years' War, all the warring religions. How do you handle it on? So we got individuals, and they are managed by the state, but they can be good actors and good participants in an emerging economy. We can avoid war and all that kind of stuff. Then the next big move, Diana talked about in her historical outline, like from World War II on, that stories of rupture. What you end up, and I think what we're ending up seeing now, is that the sacred canopy that held people together, the nation state, no longer functions, and that what the actual power is we've had the financialization of the sacred canopy, and there's lots of ways you look at it, how it goes in banking and stuff, but the basic examples are the church and the state have more allegiance to the financial structure than it does to the well-being of the democracy or the faith, and the logic of assessment and things in it. Then what's crazy is what forms you are the values in the sacred canopy. Now we're at a place where you're at this weird predicament where, because of pluralism, there's not a shared discourse, rituals, mythopoetic, all that kind of stuff, where you frame life transitions, value, ask the question of good life, you strive for faithfulness, Christ-like, all that kind of things you would in a religious language. That gets privatized, it's pluralized, and now where you live in the world, no one shares it. So what is being shared? What is the story everyone's embedded in? The financial. And then when you ask the question today, what is the good life? What do you have to do? Well, you have to get enough, you have to secure enough, you have to succeed enough, you have to outcompete enough, you have to be more efficient. The entire logic of the good life is not a question we ask. It's one we work towards eventually getting to. The good life is what happens at some point later down the road. And in order to even get to it down the road, you have to always be accumulating. You have to always be competing. And so our relationships, when they are mediated by a financialized sacred canopy, doesn't see the other as neighbor, as friend, as beloved of God. And they don't even see them as citizen, where they see them as competition for the power that secures your place for the possible future of the good life and the eschaton. And I think that shift is one that that makes what you were saying, like that things work downstream of economy. But that's our problem today. But it wasn't always that way. There were, like, if you look at the heyday prior to World War II, the nation state framed how you could have religious pluralism and a vibrant nation. And the nation had a time. And then before that, the church did. And so for me, the question is, and you said this earlier when thinking about connectedness and relatedness, like what is the institution that evaluates our connectedness and relatedness? And when it's not the divine, and when it's not even the nation state where there's like shared, your neighborly well-being and all that kind of stuff, but when it's a financial system that insists on ignoring the effects to the planet and to the poor, and demands that its winners be the ones that can accelerate these powers, then in some sense we're demon possessed. And so that's like why I thought the title is "We Hate God." A guide to American religion, because the real religion's economism, but we don't know. We don't know it all the time.
We don't.
And then
know it.
we start having these conversations we have, and we go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's really it can help me make sense of this. And then we say to ourselves, but we can't even opt out. That's the predicament. Is we might write a book and people go, that's great. And then what do you do? Because we aren't arguing with one option and trying to debate between options. The argument is under the financialized sacred canopy, where it determines what are the possibilities. Maybe you get a little more like tax incentive here to do this or whatever, but the world comes interpreted on the terms of the financial sacred canopy. And I want it's dystopian. And I've been thinking about it, but so I've been trying to think like that. I don't even know if that's a book someone buys, but it's one like I have the energy to write because I want to ask the question with my children and grandchildren, what is the good life? And think they have something to do. Like it's something worth asking about. And how do we do that? Like, it's good that we're pluralistic. It's good. And yet the pluralism and the space we made for difference culturally has been occupied by a rival religion. And it's literally the one Jesus warned about. He didn't walk around going, later, there's going to be this guy named Muhammad, watch out. Or if you ever meet the Buddha, kill him. Like Jesus didn't say this stuff. He just said, well, there's mammon and God. Which one you want? And that's the one we act as if it's value neutral. And sorry, that was a small sermon or my book pitched, Brian, but
okay, listen, I think you should write that book, but I think you should call it Why We Hate God, because that will give a little bit of intrigue, and it's the question you're going to answer. And I think more people will read it if you call it Why We Hate God. That's my free advice, and feel free to not take it.
I think you have a better luck selling. It will be more readable than really specific process infused metaphysical reflections on Jesus.
Listen, I love your Christology book and all your books, but I think you really should write that. I think you should make it super accessible, because this is really the key. And as you went through that sort of that process, it strikes me, we killed people in the name of religion under the sacred canopy. We killed people under the name of politics under the political canopy, and we kill people for the economy, and we're killing a whole lot of people for the economy. And obviously the economy was wrapped up in all of these other things, but I wonder also if part of what we're seeing is in the collapse of a sacred canopy, we end up with a racial canopy too, because it's almost like race is the residue that's left after the religious thing has evaporated, or it's become so anemic as to be insignificant. But my gosh, and then what that does, and maybe this is a good place for us to wrap up because it brings us sort of full circle. This gives a definition of God. I'm just thinking of that first question. God is among other things, God is the canopy or kingdom or realm or field or energy or however you want to say it. But God is the space in which people are formed with a set of values that can challenge the economy. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh. And suddenly you realize that's why for all of our disappointment in how churches have functioned over these 10, 20 years, and that disappointment doesn't necessarily say anything bad about the churches. It just says something about our naivete 20 years ago about the realities that were there. But you just realize we desperately need communities that propose an alternative value system to evaluate things by a standard other than the market. And gosh. So, and suddenly, if you don't have some form of God, then you are left in the tyranny of the economy. And then my economist friend, David, that's the conversation we had, is he basically just said, God, I mean, I don't know if he believes in God or of any sort or not, but it would almost be like he didn't use these words, but God help us if all we have left is the economy.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and the thing I wanted to end with was an invitation that Diane gave. She said, "I haven't been on speaking terms with God in a long time, and I'm considering praying again." How do you begin a prayer when you've been quiet for so long? And I think that she's not the only person. Even if people are, it's complicated with God. I guess we're speaking, but like looking at the last 20 years and all the conversations we're having and the challenges before us, like what does returning to God in prayer look like if you are going to attempt it?
The pastor part of me comes out at this moment, Tripp. And so what I would say is a person who has retreated from prayer for a long time, first thing you should say is, if I'm that person, if I'm Diane, I want to say, I had good reasons for doing that. I had good reasons for retreating. I had to retreat from prayer. And maybe this conversation today helps a person understand why, because hidden in that word God and in my previous concept of God and in all that entailed felt like a dysfunctional and unhealthy and dishonest and false relationship. And I didn't want to perpetuate that in myself. And I didn't want to play a role in the perpetuating of that in the larger universe, So I could imagine a prayer that might begin like this. In fact, this could be the whole prayer to start, because it's almost like excavating, scraping away all the crap, all the detritus to try to get to something solid. It would be to say, I don't know who you are. I don't know if you are you. I don't know if what I'm saying at this moment makes any sense or not. there's a whole lot I don't know. And I'm admitting that, and maybe I'll return to silence. Because in some ways, the acknowledgement in silence of what we don't know maybe prepares us for the kind of encounter that was in the very first question that we talked about. Because to encounter, let me say it this way: if part of the reason why Diane, it was Diane, right? Why Diane?
Diane, not Diana. Diane.
Okay. Part of the reason why Diane stopped praying, I'm going to guess, is because she's a good enough person to want to be honest. Mm-hmm. And so for her to just go to that part of her that wanted to be honest and not cover that up and not flee from that, not escape from that, but really go there and then say, so I there's a whole lot I don't know. And ironically, to get to the truest part of yourself, mm-hmm. that admits how little it knows, might be the place where a meaningful encounter with the reality that often is pointed to with the finger of the word God. Mm-hmm. That encounter, I think, best happens when we get to those moments of the deepest honesty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Our friend who's passed, Phyllis Tickle, once told me when I was having angsty spiritual season, and she was in California visiting, and I think everyone in a PhD program has a difficult spiritual season, but
yes.
But she was what you would say spunky and forward enough to pry it out of me, and we were driving from my house over into the city. She was speaking at a cathedral on Sunday morning, and we were talking. She goes, "All right, Trip, out with it." And I was like, "What? Out with it? What's your problem? Like, what's your problem with God? I can tell y'all are having trouble." You know what? I'm just like, "No, this is awkward. I'm driving you across Los Angeles to get to preach." and I said, "I don't have so much a problem with God. But I do, and I don't have much to say right now, and because there are things I don't know, and frustrations and anger and stuff, and I don't know who." Like the question we opened with, like, who God is. And she goes, "Oh, well, now that you've got it all emptied out, you got to start, you can fill it back up only with things you're grateful for." And she said, here's my wisdom to you. Next time, sit there long enough until things you're grateful for come to mind. And I imagine you are not the source of any of them. And then say, God, or you can just imply God, but just say thank you for. Yes. I'm grateful for. And and let gratitude fill in the word God. And then it won't be so scary to use it. And I was like, will you be my honorary grandmother? You know, and I love Phyllis, but that was one of those times where, like, I was just like, why is this one not in one of your books?
Oh my goodness.
You got to fill in God with gratitude. And I was like, thank you. And you, because sometimes she had that personality, you know, where she knows she did well and she gives you the look like, that was high quality material, right?
Oh my. Well, hey, listen, I have to make two comments on that before we end. First, if people are interested, I'm sure they'll be able to find this song by a dear friend of mine, Michael Kelly Blanchard, phenomenal songwriter. And it's a song, I think it's called Thanks Be to God, but it begins, who do you thank? Or it might be whom do you thank, but it's that construction. If people find that song, it will resonate with the story you just told. And, but my only other thing I want to say in light of that, I mean, that's a gem. What a gem. So we have Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, and Hildegard von Bingen, and Phyllis of Tickle, St. Phyllis of Tickle, which is just the right name for her. And what a beautiful, beautiful story. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for hanging out. And Tuesday, Diane, Brian, and I will all be back for the last session. Oh God, what now? Last session's titled "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" And we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Troy.